brought a real cool guest, Patrick Goodwin from Vertex Aeration. I mistakenly called him Mr. Bubbles, but it's actually Bubble Master.
Listen, two completely different connotations. Now he's going to forever be referred to by me lovingly as Mr. Bubbles from now on, but that's different than Bubble Master.
Yeah, that's a whole nother story. But what we're doing today is we're diving into aeration, and no pun intended. We are talking about surface aeration fountains, when you need them, how you size them, and I think we do a pretty good job of explaining what we need to do and when you need to put them out, don't you think?
I think we do a good job of explaining everything that we ever talk about, Matt. So, yes, I think we do a great job. I think Patrick does a better job than we do. Definitely a better job than I do.
I agree.
But he's a great wealth of knowledge. Known Patrick for a while. He's a good surfer. He likes local breweries. And apparently he likes gator hunting. So I got to get in on some of that.
That's right. Ton of experience, and I can't wait to hear all about it.
Me too. Going to be fun.
Welcome to Sitting Dockside. This podcast is for people who dig ponds and lakes as much as we do. On this podcast, we're going to bring the most knowledgeable people from all over the country, talk about wildlife, fisheries, lake construction, lake management, sit them down, hang out, and just talk some shop. I'm your host, Matt Rail. I've been working with lakes and ponds for over 20 years, and during that time, I've picked up on a ton of tips and tricks from lake and pond owners all over the country. So if you want to learn how to catch some smiles for your kids and grandkids off your lake, or how to grow some memories off your pond, then come sit with us, Sitting Dockside. You guys ready for another Sitting Dockside this week, guys? And then we got a pretty cool guest. All about Bubbles, cool. Mr. Bubbles himself. and Troy, do you have a good week?
I've had a great week. It's been quite phenomenal. Sitting here with being able to see Patrick makes me happy. I did a thing a while back, and I talked about how good my hair was getting to be, and it was up there with Richard Gere and Michael Landon. Patrick's hair is very Richard Gere-esque. I'm just telling you, it's good hair, buddy.
Yeah.
I guess all the listeners are now going to have to want to chime in and see the video, right?
That's right. That's called I don't know what that's called.
I think you're a little jealous about the hair. I've never known a friend that talks about their hair more than you, Troy. That's not a good or bad thing. It's interesting, you know?
Yeah, look, I like good hair. And mine typically is. So.
I got some good news. The Sitting Dockside is still in the top 20% of all starting podcasts, which is, good thing. We just hit iHeartRadio.
Nice.
What?
Yeah. And
wow.
And then if I can do it correctly, it'll really, really impress you. So I'm going to try this right now. Okay. Alexa, play Sitting Dockside podcast.
Here's Sitting Dockside from Apple Podcasts. Continuing from where you left off.
No way.
Yep.
Congratulations.
That's what I'm talking about right there.
20 years.
I was honestly expecting Otis Redis to start playing Sitting on the Top
Alexa off.
Time.
Yeah, I don't know if you got to hear that. I should have turned up the volume, but so now our listeners can just ask Alexa to play Sitting Dockside podcast, and
will Siri do that too?
Siri, I don't know. I haven't tried.
Hey Siri, play Sitting Dockside podcast.
1 moment. Okay, Sitting Dockside podcast coming up. Hey, this is
Yes.
No way.
What I'm talking about.
Yeah. So, So yeah,
Big stuff, buddy.
that's pretty exciting stuff. That all came
Nice.
this week.
Awesome.
But back to our amazing Mr. Bubbles is basically what a lot of guys are. What's your name tag say on your desk?
So my colleagues got me a plaque that says Bubble Master.
Okay,
Master's degree.
different than Mr.
But no, my real title is Aquatic Resource Scientist.
Okay,
So I
and
don't
you
just
travel.
do bubbles. I do all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
Aquatic
So you-
resource.
Yeah, so let's lay the groundwork. You work for Vertex Aquatic Solution, which is traditionally, historically, have been a very large manufacturer of aeration, particularly bottom-based aeration systems, correct?
Yes.
And
Yep.
then you've been there for 7 years, and where we met is that you're going around educating people, and you've done dozens and dozens in front of general public, professionals, teaching them about the benefits of aeration, right? And then
Yep.
you have a master's actually in lake management from New York State University. Did I say that right?
Yes. State University of New York.
Okay.
SUNY Oneonta. Yep.
And there you did some work on a 100-acre lake in your master's. There, tell me a little bit more about that. And then,
Yeah. So the program up at SUNY, it's an applied master's degree in lake management. So we're looking at all aspects of lake management, building comprehensive management plans. So looking at everything within the lake, but also that's draining to it, watershed and so forth, and putting forth a plan, going through each aspect of the lake, from what's currently being done with it to the objectives that the stakeholders would like to see for it, and all the management strategies that you can utilize. And one of the reasons why I picked this lake was because they had an existing aeration system there, and wanted to learn more about aeration, how it works, the pros and cons of it, benefits, and so forth. And just learned a whole bunch, and is now kind of rolled over to what I do now. A lot of those diagnostics and testing that I learned in my master's is what I'm also doing now with my career, which is part of the consulting side of things that I do.
right. And you say what'd you say, a comprehensive lake management plan. That dive into that. Basically, let's see if I can get it here. Is that basically you listen to the objectives or the goals from you said stakeholders, there's a lot of people, and then you define where they're at, and then you kind of fill in the gaps of how to get there, right? Is that, did I answer that?
Yeah,
right?
correct. It's a data-driven decision management. So sitting down with the stakeholders is step one, finding out what their water quality issues are, what issues they have, plant issues, fisheries, what their objectives are, and so forth, and then taking all that information and building a study design that will be able to figure out what the underlying issues are for what they've explained, and then how to address them in the most cost-effective way, essentially. So looking at everything from nutrient budgets to hydrology budgets, doing water quality modeling. We're looking at biological structure of the entire food web, everything from algae to zooplankton to fisheries, and how we can utilize that to meet their objectives, either from a water quality standpoint or from a fishery standpoint. I mean, it really covers a little bit of everything, lake management, all aspects. So it's very applied, social, the sciences, and then also kind of brings in this industry as well, because we're going to know about these techniques and the costs and how well they're going to be effective, and are they going to meet the stakeholders' goals.
All right, got it. So aeration is one of those interesting topics. Let's first talk about, we have surface aeration, and then we have bottom-based aeration systems, and we have fountains. Let's kind of quickly skim over that, and then let's dive into which one works best for where and why.
No, I actually had this conversation with a gentleman today that has a 5-acre lake, a deep 5-acre lake. He's growing really, really large fish, and this was his question. He's got some surface aeration, and he made the comment that he had quit fertilizing, and would he still need lake bottom aeration? And we had to have the whole conversation about why fertilization and thermoclines really don't have anything to do with each other, or at least phytoplankton. So, yeah, this is a great topic for right now.
Yeah, awesome. But so, when would you use surface aeration? I got a fly buzzing around my head. So when would you do surface aeration, and when would you do bottom based aeration system, and when would you do a fountain, Patrick? What do you tell people when it comes down to that?
Yeah, so I kind of try to break it down for stakeholders, homeowners and so forth. I like to use this framework, this kind of the 3-legged stool of lake management, where we have to meet all 3 legs of this stool for that technique to be the kind of the preferred technique. So it's going to be, technically effective. So is it going to work, meet our objectives for what we're trying to do in that lake? Is it within budget? And then also, is it institutionally acceptable, regulatory side? So I think for aeration, the institution side usually isn't much of an issue. So it really comes down to cost and technical effectiveness. And so for fountain aerators or for surface aerators, they're going to be the most technically effective in shallower bodies of water. So I would say shallow, less than 6 feet deep. You'll be able to get, small and shallow, I should say, 6 feet deep, an acre or so. They can be effective in, maintaining oxygen levels within the lake. And where traditional bottom diffused aeration, where you're taking compressed air and pumping it down to the bottom of the lake, inducing a bubble plume, which is what's behind me right here, is going to be much less effective in those shallow areas. We just don't have a lot of time for those bubbles to exchange oxygen. We're not able to effectively mix the water as well either in those shallow areas of a lake. You could use those, so there's kind of like a transition zone as well, where we're starting to get a little bit deeper, 6 to 8 feet, or I'm sorry, 6 to 10 feet, where you could go with a fountain and an aerator in conjunction if you are putting fertilizers in for trying to grow big fish and so forth, where you have high oxygen demand and you need that extra, you kind of need everything you got in your toolbox to try to maintain adequate oxygen, so you don't lose that fishery. So there's definitely a time where you're going to want to look at possibly doing both those techniques, especially in deeper and shallower areas of the lake. From a technical effectiveness standpoint, bottom aeration is going to be your kind of go-to approach once you start getting about deeper than 8 feet. It's going to be the more effective approach for adding oxygen, maintaining water quality, and kind of going back to that 3-legged stool. Cost is always a big factor as well too. So I've kind of laid out what would be most technical effective. Fountains in shallower areas. Aeration is going to be more effective in these kind of starting to get into deeper water. Aeration by far is going to be the most inexpensive approach because we're moving air as opposed to water. So from an electrical standpoint, you're not going to be eating up too much of electric bill as compared to a fountain where you're moving water. Just the energy to move water is just much greater, and the capital cost to install just a compressor that's just pumping air or even pure oxygen, we have those available. That is an availability as well too. Is going to be much cheaper. You'll be able to get a lot more done cost-wise with a bottom diffused aeration than a fountain aerator. So there's definitely pros and cons. If you're not meeting your objectives, even though it's cheaper, it's at the end of the day you're kind of falling short. So you kind of have to look at this and what's your end objective, regardless of cost, is kind of the first and foremost, and then kind of start weighing your options. Could I do an aeration and a fountain to try to reduce that cost? Or there's a variety of different ways of looking at it. So
Right. Yeah, you kind of hit on the same way I think about it too, is that fountains, shallower, they do a really good job of throwing water up. So anytime you do that, you have to, when you throw water up in the air, you're losing energy and losing volume. And so it takes a higher horsepower, higher amount of energy, higher capital costs, but they look pretty. That's the advantages of them. And then, with the surface aeration, basically is a fountain without a nozzle. It just is a gigantic flushing ball of water spinning around, is what I call surface aeration. I mean, and then you get a little bit more, but a higher sphere of influence around the diffuser itself, but adding oxygen directly into the water column around there. But then but it doesn't go really deep. It doesn't get all the way through the water column. But then you have the third one called the bottom-based aeration, which you described really well, is that you have a compressor on the shoreline that the motor is out on the shoreline. It uses very low amps and comparatively to the other two, and then runs a line to the bottom of the pond, and then releases air through these designed diffusers. As it rises, it picks up and mixes water and throughout the whole water column. Did I hit everything right there, Patrick?
Yeah, I would say so.
Add to that.
The underlying processes for both aeration, or I should say surface fountains or mixers, and bottom aeration is really, there's two related but separate processes at play. One is being, oxygenation, which is coming from the bubbles, a small amount coming from the bubbles themselves. But the majority of the oxygen transfer is actually coming from physically moving water. So with the bottom diffuse aerator, the water is being moved. It's inducing this movement of water from the bubble itself. For a fountain aerator or some type of mixing device on the surface, it's physically moving it, you're pumping it, and so forth.
Right.
And then you have, circulation. It's mainly the circulation component also as well. So it brings a variety of benefits just from moving that water.
Right. Anything you want to add to that, the Goldsby?
Yeah, it's one of those things. Obviously, we work on some shallow ponds, but the majority of what we're working on are probably 12 acres and less. But even in those 1 and 2 acre lakes, a lot of times pond, whatever you're going to call it, reservoir, they can be fairly deep. A lot of times people are damming up small hollers, and so that depth causes an issue when we only try to use surface aeration. We typically always have a thermocline in every one of our reservoirs that we manage, and without lake bottom aeration, we are just not getting that thermocline out of the water column. And what we see typically in this part of the country, we will have fish mortality based on straight plant respiration and plant die-off, but the majority of the time we see turnovers at some point in the year from a cold rain breaking that thermocline. So I've always found that the lake bottom aeration is more thorough at protecting against any type of potential low oxygen scenario.
That's a good segue. You said a few things. It's basically, you're talking about bottom-based aeration systems working in deeper water. And then, Patrick, why don't you hit on, he said a couple of times, thermoclines, and why do these work better when you get deeper?
So the majority of what bottom diffuse aeration, the benefits of what it's doing is artificially destratifying the lake. And so it's maintaining homogenized temperatures and densities throughout the entire water column so that oxygen can easily get into the water from the atmosphere. And during the hotter months, you have this phenomenon that develops within a lake. All lakes will experience it for the most part, called stratification. So you have, warm, less dense water sitting on top of cold, more dense water. And when this process occurs, you have these, it is essentially a physical barrier that stops oxygen from getting down into that more dense, cooler water. And so you have your sediments and all this other stuff that's fallen down that is essentially an oxygen demanding, a high oxygen demanding layer of sediment on the bottom that's just pulling oxygen very quickly out of that layer of that volume of water. So you'll lose oxygen pretty quickly in that bottom layer of water we call the hypolimnion. And so artificially mixing 365 days a year or during periods where you know you're going to have stratification is essentially insurance against that physical phenomenon from ever occurring.
Right. Yeah, let me expand on that. We used to have a visual tool, Troy, that was oil and vinegar in a big pickle jar. You know those big, huge half-gallon pickle jars? And
Sure, absolutely.
and then I put oil, and then the vinegar, I would add a little bit of pond dye in it, or pond color, and then it would separate itself, and we call it the jar of stratification. You know?
I got you.
Yeah. And Kerry Martin really ran with that. He was like, "Don't ever bring the jar of stratification to my house. Don't let ever take the lid off the jar of stratification." And so long story short is that what Patrick is hitting on, just to expand it a little bit in a visual sense, is that your lake, when you're a kid and you jump in and you feel your feet are cold, everybody called that the spring. That's when my spring fed in my lake. That's when my feet are cold. Well, no, it's not. It's actually the vinegar part of the jar of stratification. It's actually separated, and Patrick did it very good. Is that basically, you have two separate areas in which this lake will in slow moving ponds that don't flush a lot, that you will actually separate. And then it's like laying a piece of plastic, which you hit on, Troy, and is a thermocline. It's like laying a piece of plastic along there, and two separate bodies of water, and all the organics and everything work on bottom. So your oxygen demand is so much higher on the bottom half of that area, that colder region, and it will suck up the oxygen quicker, and it can lose oxygen. And that's where Patrick, you're going to lead into is, I think you got a great slide here, is that you're separating. Now your lower area is losing oxygen, and you're putting bottom-based aeration system to mix that, now ever allowing stratification to occur. And I always called bottom-based aeration systems destratification systems, not allowing the pond to get in two separate layers. And it's very important for a pond owner to understand this, but so many different ways. But yeah,
I really like that terminology, because there's a lot of different terminology for these types of systems: aeration systems, bottom diffuse aeration, circulators. But I really enjoy that. I like that word, bottom or destratifiers or destratification systems.
I would like to, before we're done with this, talk about one other issue with 365 days was mentioned a while ago. I live in a region that is kind of weird, North Alabama to Kentucky. We flirt with Florida genetics with our bass. So just later on, after we talk about what Patrick's going to show before we get done, I'd like to talk a little bit about why maybe in some regions of the country, if you're trying to maintain some Florida strain genetics, why you may not aerate 365 days a year, depending on the depth of the lake. Just a little caveat there.
And sometimes in some hot regions too, which you're in Florida. We'll expand on that. Let's lay the general aspects here of why you need bottom base and what it does, or destratification systems, and then let's lead on to some more of a higher level of when and where.
Yeah, I guess so. For our listeners out there who can't see this visual, this is a 2D diagram of what a lake would look like when stratification is occurring, where we have this, warm upper layer, less dense upper layer of water that's, it is oxygenated. This is where, you can run into issues with algae and so forth. Then you have this kind of transition layer, which is, we call it your metalimnion, which will include your thermocline. And that's just the depth at where you have the greatest temperature change would be where your thermocline is. And then everything below that is where you're going to have your hypolimnion, your anoxia, or low oxygen levels, once you lose oxygen in that layer, in that bottom hypolumion, it sets the stage for a lot of the water quality issues that you will have in a lake. You'll start having hydrogen sulfide being produced, ammonia being produced, both of which are very toxic to fish. Iron is going to start going in from ferric to ferrous and release phosphorus, which is the driving nutrient for plants and algae. So, how much phosphorus you have in your lake is how much algal biomass, how much plant biomass you can have. There's a good kind of rule of thumb: 1 pound of phosphorus can support 500 pounds of algae and plant growth. And it will also just reduces your habitat from a fishery standpoint. So if you have a lake that's 10 feet deep and your stratification is developed at, your thermocline's at 5 feet, you only have 5 feet of
water
habitat for your fish.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I think a lot of people miss on this is if you are supporting a large fish population in the winter months, if you're not, aerating, then you're trying to support the same biomass of fish in the summer months when you have potentially only a third of the water body there to do that with, and it can get very difficult.
There's a great study out of Mississippi State that Dr. Wes Neal did with some of our systems, looking at fish growth and productivity and so forth, or the loading capacity of fish, how much fish you can have, how big you can get them with and without, aeration. And there was a great publication he put out about 1.5 years ago. If you guys are interested.
Yeah, what do you find out? Give us the.
Essentially, long story short, you were able to, your loading capacity increased significantly. You can have more fish per unit area. However, without supplementing, but with that more, you have more and more fish, there was a decline in the bigger, the larger size class of fish. So you had more fish of a decent size, but if you just had aeration, you weren't supplementing with feeding and other strategies, you were essentially taking that biomass and spreading it out to more fish and allowing all of them to get to a certain size. It's been a while since I've read it, but that's essentially what I got from it, was that your loading capacity, the amount of fish you can hold per unit volume, increases with aeration significantly. The entire ecology becomes better. You have better, not from a water quality standpoint, but also from an ecological standpoint, zooplankton and so forth. You have a better forage base. But you also need, if you're trying to grow trophy fish, big fish, you also are going to want to supplement it with additional feeding.
So it's a bullet. It's a bullet in the arsenal.
Yeah.
It's not the silver.
But in doing that too, it opens up your ability to fertilize. If you're wanting to fertilize for phytoplankton bloom, it opens up the ability for you to feed heavier if you want to use larger amounts of fish food, because you have an entire water column that's now available to do all that with, instead of this very thin layer of pond to do that.
Look, there was basically somebody I was working alongside of, and they said they had a very small, I don't know, it was 1.5 acres, and they were a little bit fuzzy. There was like $2,400 to put everything in that we needed to do with a destratification system, and it might have been a little bit more or less, I don't know, but it's relatively, let's just say 3,000. And then they were sitting there talking. I was like, well, what if I could double the volume of your lake? I mean, and they were like, yeah. And then would you do that for 15 or 20,000? They were like, yeah, we would get twice as much area. I was like, well, that's exactly what you're doing with the bottom-based aeration system, is increasing the growing area, into which, because they were stratified, it was eutrophic, and they were only using the top 4 feet during the hard parts of the summer, and now with the destratification system, they were using it was increasing their whole entire volume, at least by double, if not, a little more. And then that kind of brought it home, like, okay, yeah, I see the value of why you need to do this, but I was always going to say, back to bottom-based aeration system, without aeration, we usually say somewhere between 200 and 400 pounds of fish. With aeration, we say 800 when you feed. Then you can actually get that up to close to, even get another 400 pounds on top of that. And so, and with habitat and good, good management strategies. So, yeah, it really makes a difference when you add a little more bottom-based aeration system, increasing the volume and everything else. But it actually does. I want to hit, now that we laid kind of the general form, let's kind of get some cool stuff. And this is where Patrick has done some really cool work. It does some really cool stuff to the bottoms too by adding oxygen to the sediments in the bottom. Talk a little bit more on your work with that.
Yeah, so we've come a long way since I think it was the 1950s when aeration was first used to address oxygen issues. It was used for, actually, I believe in Wisconsin, to improve a trout fishery. We've been learning so much more about all of these different processes. It's not just about improving a fishery, but it's also really improving water quality. And a big part of that is that it's maintaining oxygen, maintaining aerobic conditions right at that sediment water interface is really where a lot of that magic happens. And we've developed in time to be able to analyze the sediments and be able to make more informed decisions of just how well an aeration system can work. A big driving force of why people utilize this is definitely because of the oxygen, but also kind of the flip side, if you're using this for water quality restoration and you're not really managing for fisheries, you want as little phosphorus as possible. And so adding an aeration system, adding oxygen, maintaining aerobic conditions at that sediment water interface will essentially maximize the lake's ability to process phosphorus. And it's a function of iron and how much iron you have in those sediments. And we have testing that we can do. There's just kind of simplistic testing, just looking at ratios of iron to phosphorus, to more advanced, fractionation, and actually how much iron is actually bound to phosphorus. So we can get really detailed and quantify, phosphorus loading from sediments and nitrogen loading from sediments, and so forth, and use that information to model and determine how well this technique will work and improve water quality. It's used in so many different facets of our aquatic industry, and a big part of it is because it amends the sediments and improves your sediment chemistry, helps digest a lot of that organic material, which
you say it digests organic material. How does it? Talk a little bit. Why do you get organic material without oxygen, and then when you add oxygen down there, you said it actually can dissipate? Yeah, hit on that.
Yeah, so it's just a natural process for all lakes. They're all aging essentially. So, and when I say aging, as every year they're going to receive some type of organic material from the watershed as rain hits that watershed and drains the pond. They're going to receive grass clippings, trees, and leaf, and then even organic material that's self-generated within the lake itself from phytoplankton, algae, and so forth, plants and stuff. Over time, it's kind of like a train. They're all kind of going one direction, and each year they have more and more organic material that's going to be deposited onto the bottom of these lakes. The more organic material, the more oxygen demand. And so as these lakes age, small ponds that are being fertilized regularly, they're going to age a lot quicker than one of the drinking reservoirs for Boston, which is the Quabbin, which is completely the forested watershed. They're going to age a little bit slower than a very developed watershed and so forth. So as you get more and more organic material deposited, you increase your oxygen demand, and you're going to have more and more muck. So if you can add and maintain good aerobic conditions, it will help process a lot of that organic material, that load that's coming in every single year, and help process it and maintain the lowest amount it can naturally, essentially.
So does it? It'll digest it. If you don't have oxygen down there and you have all this organics, you mentioned that it makes muck. Is it?
It will make muck. So one of the things that happens is when you start losing oxygen, you go more and more into oxygen debt. You start changing your electron acceptors from oxygen to nitrate to sulfur, which the byproduct of that electron acceptor is going for bacterial respiration is going to be sulfide. And what they produce is a lot of muck in that it's like a gelatinous muck layer that you can see. And what we'll find is once you've restored this oxygen, you'll see this all gets condensed back down into a more natural, process state. So you can even see oxidized iron on the surface. You have like kind of this brown layer, and then kind of marl black layer underneath. It's pretty cool, pretty interesting.
So yeah, so you're saying if you didn't put an aeration system, you actually can. The byproduct of things decomposing is this.
It's
black. Yeah, like when you're a kid and you stepped in a swamp and it smelled like somebody farted next to you.
Yeah.
Nice, buddy.
Smells like a little bit of the Troy Goldsby down there.
That's not true. This is not true. I think people need to understand one of the things needed for a more thorough amount of decomposition is oxygen. Things just don't decompose as well without oxygen.
Yeah.
So if you're adding oxygen to that bottom layer as things fall down there, they have the oxygen required for their actual decomposition to occur.
So
creating less of the muck layer.
Yeah, I like your way.
That's a good point. Yep.
But you're saying now, okay, we did have oxygen down there. We stratified, we made a bunch of muck and it smells, and you also get some taste and odor issues. And then you add aeration in there. You have actually seen that muck layer decrease.
It gets consolidated, and so you have initial consolidation. If you've had a large amount of this, muck, accumulated, it gets consolidated and is processed up to a certain point. So there's a case study that we have, East Twin Lake out in Michigan. It was like a 900-acre area. There was a 200-acre portion that had it was like a paper mill. They had a lot of organic material being deposited in this mill. And we very high oxygen demands, screaming oxygen demand. So we restored deep water oxygen, restored oxygen to that sediment water interface. And you can see this kind of linear reduction in muck level, and then it kind of tapers off. So we have this, you have this initial digestion kind of getting you back to where your natural state would be, and then it tapers off. And so anything else that's coming in, you're not really accumulating much more. It's just kind of maintaining, a consolidated,
okay,
as best as you can.
Yeah,
I'm gonna try an analogy real quick, and y'all correct me if this is completely off target. I like to try to find analogies. What I like to do is I like to try to find ways for people to visualize what we're talking about, because most of the time people never see this underwater layer that we're discussing.
Mm-hmm.
If you build a fire, let's say fall in.
Yeah.
If you build a fire and you don't have good oxygen that really gets that fire stoked and going good, when you're done with that fire, you're left with a ton of just charred, unburned wood because you haven't had enough oxygen for that fire to burn the wood well. If you have a good fire pit that gets a lot of oxygen to it and you get that fire roaring, because of the oxygen there, everything nearly burns completely and you're only left with a little bit of ash at the end. That's similar, right?
Yeah.
Very similar. Yep. That's a good analogy. I like that. I'm going to plagiarize that.
Yeah. We did work on a municipality, and we put aeration system in there, and we noticed a little bit of digestion per year. But then we were doing a benthic study on top of it, meaning that taking a grab of the mud, and then they were looking at the diversity of creatures in there, and they can tell how good the water quality is with that. So they were doing that the study wasn't doing, the muck wasn't really going down. We were there 3 years. It was going down a little bit, quarter inch. And then 4 or 5 years later, I returned and it was no muck there. I thought they dredged it. And so I called the people and they came out and they're like, no, we didn't dredge it. We didn't do anything out here. And it was very, you could see some of the original bottom. It was definitely the difference in this organic layer. And we look back and then basically it was the density of that muck. It was slowly going down. And then it got to a point that it was really kind of dense. And then these tubular worms in there, which actually feed a lot of bluegill, by the way, it's moved in these certain types of, and then once they've done that, it was a sponge effect and they were pumping water in and out. You like my fingers going, you like that? Little hand gestures. That they were pumping water in and out, and then that is when there was a large impact in the digestion of this organic layer. So that was,
and we do see that quite often as well too, not only with our own stuff, but in the peer-reviewed world, where you've made the sediment quality, you've improved sediment quality, and your invertebrate community comes in, and you have this very diverse, benthic invertebrate community, which is what you want for fisheries and so forth. And they can help, they can process and break down the muck as well too. Just you're going from, if you don't have oxygen down there, your dominant species is going to be, chironomid, midges, and so forth, like the bloodworms, which can hold on to oxygen for an extended period of time. That's why when you pull them up, they're red. They have that hemoglobin. To a diverse assortment of benthic invertebrates once you've added that oxygen.
right, which is a huge food source to fish, and we're going to lead into that. But they can actually, adding oxygen on the bottoms, I think it's really, that whole sediment water interface is often overlooked in so many management strategies, just because it's the biggest consumer of oxygen, it's the biggest producer of phosphorus, biggest community of food for a lot of bluegill and forage base, including gizzard shad and everything else. And we hardly ever talk about it. But what we're going to lead to that is aeration does a lot of cool things for zooplankton too, right? And not alone with stuff like zooplankton being critters, and what does it do for the water column itself with algae and that?
Yeah, so we're talking a lot about the chemistry of it. Kind of want to get back to some of the physical benefits of aeration. Just moving that water can provide a lot of benefits also from a food web standpoint. It can provide more favorable algal species. So a lot of noxious types of algae that you can have in your lake are some of the first species to ever develop on our earth are cyanobacteria. They're the first to come in. They have developed under very reducing conditions, and they have evolved to be able to handle all different types of situations and outcompete a lot of other algae groups. And one of the things that they can do is produce gas vesicles, which allows them to buoyant themselves up and down in the water column. And so when you start mixing and you have a turbulent flow going through, throughout your water, you are essentially leveling the playing field for other algal groups that can then compete with these more noxious cyanobacteria. It's often toxin-producing algae. So it levels the playing field, and we'll oftentimes see a more desirable food web. So especially from a fishery standpoint, that's what you want. You want to have green algae and diatoms coming in. That mechanism really promotes a lot of the diatoms, which is a preferred food source for zooplankton. That is because the diatoms, they have this heavy frustule, and they sink very quickly. So when you start mixing, you have a prolonged prolonged diatom season, which means your zooplankton are doing well. You got big daphnids, and zooplankton is doing well, then your forage space is doing well, then it goes all the way up your food web and you have nice big fish. It also helps just from mixing and improving water quality, we tend to see, you know, a 2 to 3-fold increase in zooplankton. So that's what your forage fish are feeding on, predominantly is zooplankton. So that can be a big game changer in terms not only for your fisheries, but also in water quality, because zooplankton eat algae. And if you're trying to improve water quality, the more zooplankton you have, and the more algae they're eating, the cleaner and clearer your water is going to be.
That's pretty cool, because I use the analogy, like a lot of times you get a pound of phosphorus in your lake. And if you're Greg Grimes in Georgia, that may be a good thing because he's extremely phosphorus limited in Georgia. But, you know, for the rest of the world, you know, and I think where you're at, Troy, too, is that we always try to say, you know, you got this phosphorus, pound of phosphorus, it could go anywhere. And if it goes to filamentous algae, you treat it, it's going to go somewhere else. And a lot of times it'll go to and end up in cyanobacteria, which is not really your goal and probably worse than what you originally started with. But if you can, with aeration, what you're telling me is it increases the zooplankton. We're not pushing that phosphorus in a more benign way. We're actually pushing that phosphorus up the food chain, what you're saying. We're pushing, so therefore we get more zooplankton, we get more fry fish, we get more larger fish, we get more organisms in the entire community that are utilizing those nutrients instead of cyanobacteria, filamentous algae, you know, weeds, or, you know, or something else is undesirable, you know. Did I hit that or what? I mean, am I correctly?
That energy flow is going to be going up that food web as opposed to going down the food web with aeration. If you don't have aeration, your energy, most of your phosphorus and nitrogen, it's going to go down the food web into detrital pathways and bacteria, which are going to consume oxygen. So
they say it.
Yeah. So you're absolutely right. You're taking, when you start adding oxygen, you maintain good oxygen 365 days a year, you'll be able to have a much more robust food web, and a lot of that nutrients is going to be able to go into things that you would more, you know, species that you want, you know, producing a better food web, better fishery, and so forth.
Right. And do you want to say something, Troy?
No, I'm learning what you're talking about.
The nitrogen. Now, phosphorus is the limiting element, but as soon as phosphorus becomes not limited, we were able to, and nitrogen's really high, a lot of times we see cyanobacteria. But aeration actually does something cool with that you taught me about too, and hit on that. And you did some work with that, right? Or not? Or
so maybe not for like nutrient ratios. Yes, we have some. I've done some case studies with that. It really kind of comes back down to, you know, the types of algae that you can have present, and what their preferred source of, or preferred form of nitrogen.
mm-hmm.
So as I said before, cyanobacteria came very early on in the Earth's history. So they evolved under very reducing conditions. So the preferred form of nitrogen that they like is this ammonium. That's toxic to fish. It's the NH3, NH4 forms of nitrogen that you do not want to be dominant in your water body. It's going to wreak havoc on your fishery and so forth. And they get formed when you don't have oxygen. And so in our, you know, kind of going back to this history of, you know, algae coming into this Earth's evolution, you know, green algae came in much later on and diatoms as well, and they evolved under oxygen-rich environments. So cyanobacteria came in under reducing environments. They started putting oxygen in the atmosphere, and then we have green algae starting to come in, and their preferred food source of nitrogen is nitrate and nitrite, which is what you would want in your water body as the dominant form of nitrogen to support your fisheries, support your food web, and so forth. And so maintaining aerobic conditions in your water column is also going to favor species of algae like green algae and diatoms. So it's kind of getting back to the chemical side of how aeration can improve, you know, the biology of your system There's physical, chemical, and biological aspects of how it can improve your system.
Right. And then, but it actually changes it. The nitrogen, does it put it in the air? When I think of nitrogen, a lot of times you think of a gas. Does it release it, or does it change the little more of the biota in the water column itself?
So if you have stratification present and you have this, anoxic hypolimnion, you're going to have ammonification from the sediments. So the sediments are going to release a whole bunch of ammonia and ammonium. And you're going to have this pocket of, in the hypolimnia, a large amount of ammonia built up.
Which is toxic to fish.
Which is very toxic to fish. Ammonia is extremely toxic to fish. When you add aeration, you'll have an initial degas off of all that built up ammonia and reduced forms. So what we'll see in some of these case studies that you'll have this kind of large drop off in, if you're looking at total nitrogen, or even these more reduced forms, large drop off in total nitrogen, and then it stabilizes. So it kind of depends if you're putting it in before stratification has developed, before you have that ammonification, you probably won't, from 1 year to, if you had a baseline, yes, you definitely would see, a little bit less because you're not having stratification, you're not having ammonification with this aeration system in.
Yeah. Okay.
It's amazing stuff. There's so much that goes on with, there's just so much that happens inside of a reservoir that people just don't ever think about. I mean, it's really endless.
It is, but
we're learning so much every day. Yep.
It's oxygen, though, is life. That's the way I look at it, And if you have a body of water that's creating a thermocline, I don't care what the depth is, and and you want, anything to achieve long term, especially if it's getting older, you do need some mixing, and it's really not that crazy expensive, to get things going and get things moving. I'm a big proponent for it. I don't know where you're sitting at, Troy, but
I don't approach lake management without aeration being a part of the conversation. Lake bottom aeration, it just has to be in this part of the world, in my opinion. So.
Yeah, it's slow moving, and it's just, if you stratify, you're asking for trouble long term.
Well, and people need to understand too. I've talked to people and they're like, so I can put 1 or 2 diffuser heads in. I'm like, no, listen, this has to be sized properly. If you're going to use it effectively, otherwise you're really not doing what it's meant to do. So it needs to be sent in. The lake needs to be sent in with the depths, and let a system be designed. Otherwise, you're just throwing money away. I mean, if it's not sized properly, you're not going to achieve all of the things that we've been talking about for the past hour.
So what do you mean? So don't buy it from Amazon?
If he starts, if Bezos starts sizing them properly, maybe, but they're gonna have a look. I mean, he can come by Vertex Quantum Solutions. I don't know, and then they can size them for Amazon, but we'll see.
Yes. So sizing aeration systems or oxygenation systems. So there are other techniques out there where we're not mixing, we're just adding oxygen. They're more expensive, but sometimes you don't want to do that because you have a cold water fishery and you need cold water and you need oxygen. But sizing has been a big part of what I do for Vertex, and also part of my master's as well. So it really kind of comes down to a couple parameters when we're thinking about sizing these systems and how much, it's the diffuser density, how many diffusers we have, the amount of airflow, and placement. And so where we're placing it, how many we have, and how much turnover, how much water we're actually mixing per day is the key parameter that we tend to look at. There's a variety of other ways of looking at it. But first and foremost, we want to ensure that the sizing is going to meet your objectives. And the best way to meet your objectives is to ensure that we're adding enough oxygen to overcome your daily demand. And then we're also breaking stratification. And so there's ways that we can quantify both of those. For oxygen, some people I've seen use biological oxygen band, chemical oxygen band. I don't like those at all. It's not a very good measurement for lake oxygen band. We want to look at the entire lake's respiration. So that all comes mainly, the majority of it comes from the sediments. And so we have ways, if you have dissolved oxygen and temperature profiles, which are so valuable in the sizing process, we can take that information and determine, the area of anoxia, the area where we're actually having this layer of anoxia occur, and figure out how much oxygen or how much water I need to move to overcome that demand.
Okay.
Really,
that brings a good question. It has to be sized correctly. What do you want? What do you need somebody to do or send you to be able to size correctly?
So there's three main things that I ask for is I need an accurate volume. So I need a bathymetry map of some sort, or someone going out there. If it's a smaller pond, you can definitely just do spot checks. Having some sense of, how much the water is going to fluctuate is also, we want to size for perfect storm conditions, right? So when we have the least amount of water depth for the system to be mixing and so forth, have some sense of dissolved oxygen and temperature as well. So some profiles in the lake over time would be ideal. The more the better, the more data the better. If you had some sense of water quality, that's helpful. But honestly, if you have a good bathymetry map, have accurate volume, and I know if I have that, and I have dissolved oxygen, I have temperature, I can calculate the what we call the oxygen demand in grams of oxygen per meter squared per day. I take that value and I can then calculate how much turnover, how much I need mixing and oxygen added per day to overcome that.
Okay.
That's just from the dissolved oxygen profiles. The temperature tells me how much energy, how much mixing I need to maintain a thermal structure that's completely the same throughout the water.
So without those, a lot of times, we don't have temperature and depth profiles if we are designing one for a brand new lake. So just taking water volume, size, depth, all of that, and you are calculating worst case scenario and sizing it based on the worst case potential scenario. So I guess in all truthfulness, if you're able to take the data you're referring to and utilize that, you could probably more efficiently size the system. So where you're calculating a new one for worst case scenario, it could potentially be maybe slightly larger than what it would actually need to be if you had all of that data, correct?
Correct. So the more information you have, the more dialed in your system is going to be, and the less of a bigger hammer we have to go in with, so that we have, essentially we want to make sure the system is going to work first and foremost. So we might have to add more aeration because of these unknowns if we don't have that data. But at the same time, for smaller ponds, if you don't have that data, one of the beauties of aeration is that it's been around for a very long time. And there's a wealth of data, wealth of sizing models per region. So we have really good sizing models. Even if you don't have a lot of that water quality data, we have a pretty good rule of thumb that will that will limit that risk of undersizing or not meeting your objectives, that we can use first and foremost. So we have, kind of these theoretical or empirical models. They're empirical models because they're actual data points. We have tons and tons of these data points in different regions that we can use to dial in and size a system appropriate for your climate, for your region. And the more data you have, obviously, the better it's going to be, and the less it should be more efficient, less expensive, the more insurance and less possible risk of it being undersized.
What is the problem? What happens if you undersize a unit? If they don't size
it can cause more harm than good. And this has been shown all the time. I can't tell you how many times I go out and with my dissolved oxygen DO profile, the system's undersized.
And what happens? I mean, if they, let's say you want to save a few bucks, and just, or you Troy and I have heard this 100 times. I got a 10-acre lake. We're going to do 3 acres at a time and continue buying it. Can I do that? Or, let's save a few bucks and go, like I said earlier, to Amazon, and because it says it'll do 1.5 acres, and it's,
Yep, I run into this all the time. Clients, they don't have the full budget to do the full system, or they see a design that I've put forth and they only want to do half of it. When they say that, I have to say, we can't sell you the system, essentially, because we don't want to tarnish our name, essentially. You will cost something good.
Why would,
if you can't meet the oxygen demand of the lake, and you just bring that poor water quality up into the light zone, the epiphyletic layer, you will stimulate a massive algal bloom. You'll cause a fish kill. Your DO is going to drop. And worst case scenario, which there's a lot of good case studies out there, Bahia Del Mar is a great one, where they had a pond. They undersized it. They didn't do it right. They didn't even take depth measurements. They put the system in. They turned the lake over. Over a course of a couple of weeks, they were not even coming close to meeting the oxygen demands, killed everything in that lake. Odors could be hydrogen sulfide smells that would make silver jewelry turn green if you were close to the lake. It was absolutely insane. That's kind of worst case scenario, but if you have a lake and you're undersizing it, you are going to cause more harm than good. And it's something that, as a vendor that sells this as a solution to water quality problems, something that we want to be very careful of, because it will give it a bad rep. And it's, we want all the tools in our toolbox, but we want to make sure we're using these tools properly with, good sound science and doing things right.
Right. So you're saying everything we said, that if you don't eliminate the thermocline, all the bad things, phosphorus is released, the hydrogen sulfide is in there, it'll all come to the surface, but never get resolved. It just basically continues pumping it.
Continues. The best way I think of thinking about this is if your oxygen demand is 100 kilograms, I need 100 kilograms of oxygen, and I size the system and I'm only adding 80 kilograms of oxygen. I still have 20 kilograms that I'm not meeting. So I'm going actually into oxygen. I'm still in oxygen debt. I'm a little bit further out of debt, but I'm still in debt. And your fish need, minimum, 3 to 4 milligrams per liter dissolved oxygen, and I'm still going into debt. Your DO probe is going to read 0 milligrams per liter, but your redox, which tells you how much oxygen debt you're actually in and kind of what your chemistry is, the dominant forms, is going to still be pretty low. You're still going to be going downwards.
So yeah, you just become, and it just becomes a wreck if you don't size correctly.
Exactly.
But if you get the information, there's enough people out there that can get it correct, and you're obviously one of them. So let me ask you some other questions. We hear all the time. You got a compressor, a fountain, you hear the splashing, you don't hear the motor. Does this make noise when you have a compressor on the shoreline? We hear that every person, 80% of the people that, does it make noise? And you can answer that real quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. Compressors definitely make noise. They're like AC units. You can dampen them with sound insulation, putting trees around them. The size of the compressor definitely, and the type of compressor will tell you what type of noise as well too. I mean, there's so many different compressors out there. You get into large lake projects, well over a couple hundred acres. We're not using these little vane or piston compressors. We're using like claw compressors, rotary screws, and there are different sounds that they make, and they can be loud. But most of the small ponds, what Troy was saying was he managing about less than 12 acres. You're using predominantly, vane and piston compressors, and they do make noise. But there's ways of getting around it. You can get it down well below, I would say, like 55 decibels. And even lower than that, that's at like 10 feet.
Yeah.
I don't think I've ever installed a system that you can stand over the systems and carry on a conversation like we are now with no problem. I mean, you can stand next to it. That's how I sell it to people. They are dampened, and they're just not. I just don't see that they're an issue. I had a guy that mounted one in the top of a boat dock up top, and I was a little concerned that when he was in his boathouse, it was going to be an issue. It wasn't. It's easy. I mean, you go in there. I said, "Is that noise going to bother you?" He said, "What you talking about?" I said, "The compressor." He said, "I don't even notice it anymore." So it's not a problem.
Does there's some, you read out there, a lot of people are moving in hotter regions. They're moving the diffusers up into the water column, giving them an area into which they theorize of good habitat for fish. What is your thought on that?
It's possible. There's not a lot of information on that technique, as much as, and the reason I would say the better and more preferred approach would be to not mix if you're trying to maintain, or you're only trying to, target a certain layer. You can just add oxygen directly. So you don't actually have to have any bubbles. You can just take an oxygen generator and add as much oxygen as you can and back out based off the discharge pressure and temperature. So, in 10 feet, you can get like 17 milligrams per liter oxygen into those bottom waters. And
you would actually leave the thermocline.
It does not mix. So you can maintain cold water and maintain oxygen without actually breaking thermal stratification. And we do this obviously for cold or cool water fisheries. Even if you have like walleye, you might want to consider it, but also in some areas where, sediment, lakes that have high amounts of clay soils in their background, they can, sometimes that mixing, clay is very, very fun. It's essentially a dissolved colloidal, particle, less than 2 microns, and it will suspend for very, very long time. So if you mixing, even after a rain event, you can have clay kind of sediment come in and cause turbidity. Having mixing going on is just going to prolong it from actually settling out to the bottom. So a better approach we can do is add oxygen without mixing. It's more expensive because we don't have the benefit of oxygen being added naturally from the atmospheres. We have to pay for that extra added cost for those systems. But again, it kind of comes down to, first and foremost, technical effectiveness. Then we can start thinking about cost and try to balancing what can we not do.
Right.
With that kind of being said, that kind of goes back to the topic I mentioned earlier about the 365-day rule of thumb on aeration. Except maybe in this climate where I'm at, where we're still able to try to push the limits of stocking Florida strain bass. And the only issue with that is that we do get cold enough water temperatures in the winter months that if you are still aerating, and there's not, say, it's a deeper lake and you are homogenizing the temperature from top to bottom, you have the potential of losing Florida strain bass due to temperatures. So in those scenarios, we find that turning them off for the coldest, say 2 or 3 months, and trying to have some type of warm water layer on the bottom for those fish to kind of hide out in, we seem to lose less Florida strain bass that way.
Interesting. Yeah. That's one way. That's from a fishery standpoint. Yes, that makes sense. And, cold water will hold more oxygen as well. So you kind of have that going, with you. If you turn the system off, especially in cooler times of the year, you probably are going to be okay. You don't have to run it. I always recommend running 365 days a year because we try to burn off the oxygen debt that's been built up in the bottom waters. There was a recent
just to say, I agree completely. When people ask me, well, how long do I need to run it? Because the majority of our lakes do not have pure Florida strain basin. That's just for certain clients. I tell them 365 days a year is what you need to do for the best possible water quality. That's what we tell them. Yep. But there's been a couple of times where I have lost, not because of the aeration system, just because of the fact that I have lowered the water temperature from top to bottom in deeper lakes where there may be Florida strain fish, and they need to try to find, a lot of times they can't anyway, but they need to try to find a little bit of a warmer water refuge in those winter months.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. And what we are finding now, there's a recent publication where they were looking at intermittent, oxygenation. And they found that the longer you ran your system, the greater amount of oxygen debt you took out of the bottom sediment. So essentially, your oxygen demand will go down. You won't have as much of an oxygen demand if you can operate 365 days a year. So it just helps justify that claim of trying to run it, more if you can, to try to burn off a lot of that debt and organic material that's been accumulated.
And sure. even up in the northern region, when you say 365, are you keeping it when ice on and we have everything, and you'd still keep that deep water diffuser running
as long as you are still losing oxygen?
Okay, well that's a big difference, because we do not lose oxygen. We have oxygen to the entire water column. We're turning over. I mean, we get a lot of times 40-degree differences between top and bottom, right? And between day and night. And so we just see a lot of movement in the water column. But then, that's pretty interesting that you would. And then we do a de-icing diffuser too, and which we haven't. That's a whole nother world there. But
you can drop it down. I was going to say, you can drop it down. You don't need the full system, summertime system. You can drop it down to, one compressor, running. So that you calibrate it. And that's where, and I help with, I try to get stakeholders and people that live on the lake to just purchase a dissolved oxygen temperature probe, because then you can really dial in the system and be able to turn it on when you need it and turn it off when you don't. If electricity is the issue, or dial it, not completely turn it off, but dial it down and kind of oscillate it as you need.
Well, needless to say, just from the past 5 minutes of our conversation, this is one of those topics that's extremely in-depth, probably the most in-depth topic that you can discuss when it comes to ponds and lakes. All the more reason for a person that is not in this industry that does this as a career, all the more reason for them to contact some type of professional to discuss proper aeration for their lake, whether that's surface or lake bottom placed aeration. Very important to talk to somebody that has some knowledge, or at least can guide you in the right direction on what you need to be doing.
Mm-hmm. And testing for, even if you do it yourself, a lot of times just because there's sea bubbles doesn't mean it's working, and like Patrick says, he actually goes to the extent of having, people that are installing their units to test their whole entire water column and seeing what temperature and oxygen, see actually the functionality of it. So you can't go really wrong with that. That's for sure, but that all being said, you've mentioned a couple of times about putting pure oxygen. This is new, right? Like this is what you've been working on?
Yeah, well, it's not new. It's been done for probably just as long as aeration has been around. It's the problem with adding pure oxygen to water it's mainly been done in very large reservoirs or even smaller lakes, but it's complicated. So it's been expensive, and it requires a lot of engineering time to be able to do everything, to have liquid oxygen, to put it into a gaseous form that you can then dissolve into water. I mean, there's so much that goes into it, and we're learning more and more. And one of the things I've been working on with Vertex is to take all of that been built for these, more complicated, larger systems, and try to bring it into these, smaller, pond market, the less than, 10-acre market, something that's easier, that's more plug and play. And it takes kind of like that engineering cost out. So we have like kind of a custom system, and it's bubbleless. There's nothing, it's just pure oxygen. You're just adding pure oxygen to water at the most you possibly can based off pressure and temperature.
And then you just send it down to the bottom?
So we have two different types of designs. You have a shallow water oxygenation system. So where the thermocline, where your objective is to maintain the thermocline or stratification, and you need cold water on the bottom and oxygen, and you have, let's say, 30 feet, you would need to pump that bottom water out, oxygenate it, and then put it back in at that same density layer. Because oxygen moves within a density layer better than through a density layer. And you see this all the time with the DO and temperature probe, high oxygen at the top, low oxygen at the bottom, because you have that physical barrier, that density gradient,
Thermocline.
Get it from going down. In deep water, you have, if you're a cold water fishery and it's very, very deep, you have this luxury of not breaking thermal stratification. So you can get rid of the pump and actually just inject pure oxygen through the bubble plume. You have some bubbles, but because it's deep, it will dissipate and you won't actually break up that thermal structure and stratification. So there's two different styles of oxygenation. You have this kind of shallow water one, where you don't have that luxury of deep water, and you can't make any bubbles. Otherwise you will break thermal stratification. And then you have deep water, you're generating a little bit of bubbles, but you don't need the pump.
Interesting. So, is it sort of like what we used to do is keep a thermocline, and then it's called hypolonitic aeration. Just send it down.
It's the same thing. Yep.
We did it for trout years ago, but you're basically sculpting this into perfection, and for smaller, kind of bringing that unit to a smaller unit. And when are we going to hear more about that?
I think you'll probably be hearing about that in the next couple of months.
So you're going to do a rollout, huh?
Yeah, we're going to do a rollout and so forth. So we'll have it for every single size. We'll have like kind of the micro oxygenation where, less than an acre. Then we'll have kind of an intermediate, 3 acres, 6, 9, kind of going up. And then we'll have kind of like the bigger Mac Daddy systems for larger volumes that we need to treat. But one of the beauties about these systems is that like aeration, we're talking about mixing the whole water volume. These systems, we're only having to address the hypolimnion. So
bottom line.
Yeah, so it cuts the cost down a little bit. It's still more than traditional air. I mean, aeration is by far the cheapest way of adding oxygen to a lake. If you have the depth, all you need is a air compressor essentially, and pumping it down. You can add an oxygen generator as well, but I mean that's the most cost-effective way. But it does break up thermal structure. So if you have if you have a trout, you can't do it. I can speak to Michigan. They don't allow, because they have a lot of trout. They have a lot of cool and cold water fisheries. They don't allow aeration in any lake area that's greater than 30 feet. So it's a limitation for like any tool or any of the tools we have in lake management, pros and cons to traditional aerations. You can't de-stratify that area. So this is where this new technology would be able to come in. We're going to maintain thermal structure and just add oxygen directly.
So before you know it, Troy, you're going to be raising trout or having trout down in your lake.
Get some stripers.
I love it. I love stocking trout. One of my favorite things to do.
Hey man, well, is there any closing thoughts you wanna hit, Patrick, before we wrap this thing up?
I just appreciate you guys having me on. It's always great seeing you guys and talking with you. Appreciate it.
Wow, it's always good to see you, buddy. We got to get together soon.
Yeah, you got absolutely. I pulled a gator tag for this season, so you ever want to come down, let's go get on a gator.
And then you
Don't
said
threaten me. Don't threaten me with a good time.
you said you made some belts out of your last one, right?
Yeah, oh yeah, belts, wallets. My dog's got a nice collar. Used every part of it. Yep, jerky, meat. I mean, we're making gumbo. It's a good time.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I hope
That's
you're
delicious.
But hey, man, well, I really appreciate you coming. I really appreciate you taking the time and teaching us here at Dockside. And, you know, there's a lot to learn, like Troy said, and hopefully that people will realize that this, you know, the need, the capabilities, the benefits, and and how it would work in their particular lake. Troy, any closings you want to say to everybody?
No, just make sure that you aerate your lake properly.
Yeah.
I think Troy's ready to go to bed. I know you just got back from Vegas. So.
Woo! Vegas, baby. Oh.
That's right. Yep. All right.
So
Well,
like
thanks, guys.
60%. All right, guys. Well, appreciate it.
All right now.
Thanks, Patrick. Always good to see you, bud.
Have a good one.
Yeah, man.
This podcast, Sitting Dockside, is brought to you by Private Water Natural Resource Association, a nonprofit built just to educate private pond and lake owners on water quality and fisheries and all of that good stuff. There's videos, there's places to read, and there's a community built right into that website. So if you want to learn more, jump to pwnra.org and click, and by all means, make sure that this continues in the future. Podcast, education, video, become a member. If nothing else, there's tons of platforms. YouTube, Facebook. Just hit like, send a comment. We appreciate everything you can do here at PWNRA.